Howdy again everyone, and today I'm checking out the second of a couple of new lenses from Chinese manufacturer Sirui, their 75mm Night Walker T1.2. It's part of a set of affordable cine lenses with affordable prices, 4 of which I have reviewed already, the 16, 24, 35 and 55mm lenses. This new, more telephoto lens officially costs £379 here in the UK or $400 US, or as a set with their new 16mm lens, which I've already tested out, which gives you a free carry case. They come in gunmetal grey or this black colour. They are currently available for Sony E-mount, Canon RF, Fuji X, Micro Four Thirds or L-mount mirrorless cameras. They are completely manual lenses. They are not anamorphic lenses, and they offer an APS-C or Super 35 cropped image circle. Here is the coverage if you shoot this 75mm lens on full frame. I'd like to thank Sirui very much for sending me this lens for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. 75mm on a crop sensor camera is the full frame equivalent of about 113mm, so that's a fairly tight shot, ideal for portrait and subject photography or any other application where you really want to get your background strongly out of focus. Useful, although bear in mind that your backgrounds will be really quite compressed with this lens. You'll obviously want to pair it up with a much wider lens in your kit bag. What's really impressive is its brightness of T1.2, which is probably about f1.1 or f1.2, the equivalent. Not only does this let in plenty of light for thirsty camera sensors, which is especially important for video work, it's getting you a deeply out of focus background, even on an APS-C camera. The build quality of the lens is really quite nice, metallic and at a little over 500 grams, not especially heavy. Its physical dimensions share a lot in common with its 24, 35 and 55mm brothers in order to make the set of 3 easily interchangeable, although the 16 and 75mm lenses are just a few millimeters bigger than the others. The lens is based on a metal mount but without any noticeable weather sealing. Then there comes a geared aperture ring. It juts out from the camera mount quite early, so if you're using a very small camera, you might have a little trouble fitting it onto a tripod plate without some kind of adapter. The aperture ring turns smoothly and lightly, but the aperture points are not spaced out evenly. So, for example, trying to change between f11 and f16 is very fiddly to do. Ahead of all that comes the geared manual focus ring. It turns a generous 270 degrees, so it has plenty of precision even for such a telephoto optic at T1.2, and it has been designed so you can see the focus distance marked on either side of the lens, but not from on top. That focus ring turns smoothly and evenly and quite lightly without any damping. It has hard stops at either end, which make a pretty noisy tapping sound when you hit them. Some damping there to stop that noise while shooting would have been beneficial. Focus breathing on the 75mm lens, as you can see here, is nicely under control, which is especially important on a more telephoto lens, as you'll be focus pulling a bit more often, given a little practice of course, as manually focusing this thing takes a little while to get used to. Each of these Sirui Night Walker lenses has a 67mm filter thread. That thread is surrounded by a thick protective lip on the front edge, which can make it slightly tricky to remove thinner filters. The lens does not come with a hood and is not image stabilized. Overall, while a more expensive cine lens will handle a little better, for example an evenly spaced aperture ring and better damping on the focus ring, still the build quality of this Sirui lens is fine for the money you're paying here. It feels toughly made enough, and it certainly looks pretty good aesthetically. Okay, well, let's move on and look at image quality. I'll be testing it today on a Sony a5100 camera with its 24MP APS-C sized sensor. No in-camera corrections are available with this lens. At T1.2, the middle of the image is looking decently sharp with punchy contrast, although there is a touch of astigmatic ghostliness on contrasting horizontal edges to be seen. Corner image quality is just as sharp though. For a low budget lens at T1.2, that's quite a feat. Well done, Sirui. Stop down to T2 for those corners to become even sharper and brighter, and the middle of the image is almost perfectly sharp now. T2.8 looks just as good in the middle, but now the corners are looking essentially perfect too. Nice. The lens stays this sharp down to T8, although due to diffraction, T11 look softer. Overall, this is a very impressive, consistent performance, the kind of resolution you'll see on a much more expensive lens actually. It could be just a tiny bit sharper at T1.2, but the contrast is always very high, so the images ultimately look great. More than enough for 4K video work, that's for sure. Alright, let's take a look at distortion and vignetting, and there's more good news here. The lens projects just a small amount of pincushion distortion, barely noticeable, while the corners are noticeably dark at T1.2, but I was expecting vignetting to be much worse than this. Stop down to T2 and that vignetting quickly dissipates, so that's a very reassuring performance. The lens can focus down to 70 centimeters, which is fairly good for an optic in this portrait class. Here we are exposed to a clear weakness. At closer distances, the lens's contrast bottoms out, leaving us with a very ghostly image, and we see a lot of softness too. Stop down to T2 for an improvement. At T2.8, the image is sharpening up, although we are still catching some magenta color fringing, which goes away at T4. Now, let's see how the lens works against bright light. It's a below average performance here. The lens produces quite a lot of broad flaring, and there's also a little glare when bright lights are on the edge of the image frame. Even if you stop down to T2, that flaring sticks around. Let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh now. Generally speaking, your backgrounds look averagely smooth here, with no especially alarming problems, except for a little harsh outlining on particularly bright highlights. In the image corners, at the maximum aperture, we also see the usual cat's eye shape to bokeh highlights here, just a little stronger than usual. And finally, related to bokeh comes longitudinal chromatic aberration. At T1.2, the ghostly close-up image quality makes it hard to see, well, just about anything really. At T2, contrast returns and some visible colour fringing on bokeh highlights is visible. At T2.8 and even T4 it's still there, but at T5.6 it's mostly gone. Overall, well, when I tested Sirui's 24, 35 and 55mm Night Walker lenses, their image quality was a mixed bag from good to just mediocre. The best one I tested was the 16mm lens just a week or two ago, but actually this new 75mm lens is not far behind it. It's actually very good optically and nice value for money too, if you're willing to handle a manual focus optic at such a tight focal length, that is. With some practice you will get there, and the lens will reward you for your labours, so for video makers and perhaps even for some still photographers, it can come recommended. Thanks for watching everyone. If you find these videos helpful and find yourself watching them often, then as usual, Patreon links in the description below, where supporters get extra bonus content, plus a warm happy feeling deep inside them for helping to keep this channel trucking on sponsorship free. Ciao for now everyone.